Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this another session of Thought Leadership Series. I am Sanjeev Mota from B&K Securities. We have a very special speaker today. We have Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian, as all of you know, India's Chief Economic Advisor. Dr. Subramanian is a real thought leader, and for that, you don't have to go too far. If you have read the last 3 economic surveys, I think they are real testament to his thought process, his thought leadership. I think they are path-breaking in terms of how economic surveys are written. I think they really cover a lot of interesting structural issues. A lot of difficult issues are very well analyzed and put. So if you all have not read it, I would urge everybody to read those economic surveys. Welcome, Dr. Subramanian, for this chat.
Thank you.
So we'll keep, as I said, we'll keep this very structural in nature. We're not going to, I think you've given recent CNBC interview. If people want to see what is happening today, I think people can see that. So we'll just keep that is very structural. First question, maybe slightly tricky one. So do you consider yourself part of the government, or you are a neutral outside-in observer who's giving his comments?
Well, I must say that's a very difficult question to start with. I would actually say that, if my dharma is to be still an academic, and internally to highlight all the aspects that, need to be focused on. And so internally be very, very forthright in terms of, how we see things, and highlight what needs to be done, be very, very, very honest about the assessments, and, share what needs to be done. And in that, I will say my emphasis, has been far more on the, on what is really important for the fundamentals of the economy to really be strengthened the most. And that is what my emphasis has been. So I think that's where the reforms therefore come in. And at the same time, also externally to provide, a independent assessment of the way the economy is going. I will say that, it's part of my personality that I believe in, doing national service without craving for glory, or even being greedy for attention. That's my personality. It just comes from very old-fashioned virtues that my parents inculcated in me. I come from a very humble background, unlike possibly each one of my predecessors. As the first person to have, in my entire, both sides, mother and father's side, to have stepped into a university, I therefore come from a, maybe it is a reflection of some of these aspects. Therefore, I do believe that it is important to to try and say things that are, or let me put it this way. It's, I think, very easy to always sound like, sound negative. That's a very easy thing to do, whether it is in our interpersonal relationships with our friends, or, about life itself. It's far harder to, I think, to be equanimous, give a balanced view, especially when things are very tough. And I think, these last 2.5 years have possibly been among the toughest periods. I don't think in independent India there has been a quarter where there's been a 24% decline. So I think the rather than getting too swayed by the here and now, having that equanimity is something, that I really, really value, in myself and in others as well. And therefore, it's my personality that, I sort of try to give a balanced view rather than just, even when things basically are, looking, let's say, we're not looking very, very, good at that time. But I think, giving that balanced view, bringing in what can we expect is, I think, also part of my job. So net, I would say that, you are an independent, economist, independent academic, but you're part of a team that is important. And therefore, I do think that I don't like this I, me, myself syndrome and just basically going for glory, personal glory, even if it is at the cost of, let's say, the nation. I don't like that doesn't sit well with my personality, and therefore I don't do that thing. And at the same time, I also believe in actually giving a very balanced outlook. Even if it is the case that I'm actually, in being balanced, I am being different from the herd.
Sure.
For instance, when all through the last year, 17, 18 months, people have herded oftentimes on very negative assessments. But I have, given balanced out, assessments. And in times of uncertainty, even balanced assessments can look optimistic when they're actually just balanced, equanimous assessments, I think. But again, that is also part of my personality, that, I've always had the courage of conviction to live who I am, not caring about, how people will judge me. I think, just doing what I think is right is basically what has been part of my personality. So I've just done that. So I think these are all aspects of basically who we are as individuals.
Yeah, and that's great. Actually, just wanted to put it in context. Our rest of the, I think that's great. So one thing that I think from what I've read of your stuff in economic survey, and if I look at how NDA government has behaved even in 1999, 2004, or is behaving now, it seems to be much more supply side than demand side. Much more structural reforms rather than trying to demand manage the economy. And so, and how would you put that? So is you also would you agree that that's a right assessment?
Okay, I think that is it is a correct assessment. Let me, sort of give you the economic thinking behind this. And I think this is shaped by the fact that I spent a decade living in the United States, studying there and then teaching there as well. And during that, possibly every day of that one decade that I lived there, I would always be thinking about, what is the difference between India versus the United States? Why are things, for instance, things different in, some things that are different in the US versus, what they are in India? And one of the key things that I came away with, while analyzing the economies, is that the, emerging economies like ours really suffer from a lot of supply side frictions. I'll give you an example from the food economy. If you take the United States, you take milk. Where I stayed initially in the Midwest, Chicago, and then down south, Atlanta. But I've traveled across the place, and whenever I used to travel, I used to typically for my breakfast, etc., I would buy milk. And so I could therefore see prices of a gallon of milk, or a half a gallon of milk across East Coast, West Coast, Midwest, South. And what I found is, except for maybe a little bit of few cents of transportation costs, the prices were almost identical. In contrast, if you see in India, you don't see that at all. You basically, even if you move from one town to another, actually there are so much differences. So and as an economist, when I started thinking, actually in the US, the law of one price effectively prevails, adjusted for transportation costs, because markets are so well integrated there. You don't have as much supply side frictions. In contrast, in India, and I think the food economy is a brilliant example, of huge supply side frictions. Similarly, if you look at if you take the labor market as well, for instance, take the supply of labor. You have a lot of people who are basically part of the informal sector. Even if you look at firms as well, firms, a lot of firms that choose to be in the informal sector, not in the formal sector. So overall, when I sort of contrasted, and I used to keep observing features in the US versus India, contrast it, run it through my mental sieve, the conceptual understanding, of economics. And one of the things that I came away with is that actually, emerging markets like ours really suffer from a lot of supply side frictions. And that's what actually really holds us back. And for instance, and one of the important principles that we are taught in macroeconomics is basically Say's law, which is that that supply creates its own demand. And in India, I've observed that actually, if you see, you mentioned the Vajpayee regime,
Yes.
and that's the other thing, by the way. One of the other, and maybe it helped somehow. Crises really sort of fascinated me. The responses to crises, and so even before this crisis, I had the opportunity to really understand and study a lot, the Indian response following the Asian financial crisis vis-a-vis the global financial crisis, for instance. When you look at the Asian financial crisis, what did India do? Under Vajpayee ji, we actually, built a huge infrastructure, infrastructure pipeline, at that time, huge increase in capex, built the golden quadrilateral, and we basically did reforms, and three key sets of reforms stood out. The telecom revolution, BSNL was sold, and competition was opened up. Small scale, reservations that were there were removed, and privatization was done. For the first time, privatization, happened, and these were all supply side basically reforms. At the same time, also, the focus on capital expenditure, again supply side. And what did we have at that time? We actually, growth declined to less than 4% because of the Asian financial crisis. But because of the supply side reforms, of which construction sector activity was very important, which was driven by the capital expenditure. So when you have construction sector activity, you have jobs being created in the informal sector, and that is really important because they are the vulnerable section of the economy. Construction sector activity, because a lot of urban poor work in the construction sector. So the capex push actually enabled construction sector activity, created jobs in the informal sector, thereby put money in the hands, actually demand increase. And if you go and look at that, a few months back, I wrote a piece in the Economic Times contrasting this as well. You had, really good growth that came in at that time without inflation. Current account, there was no problem. Fiscal deficit was also not a problem. There were no direct transfers that were given, at that time. And why is this? Because again, this is sort of Econ 101. I have demand supply, right? If I only push demand, do nothing on supply, what happens? I basically increase prices. I do increase quantity, but price increases significantly. And you get, especially in a country with a lot of supply side frictions, if you push demand, and supply does not respond, you actually get runaway inflation. What happens then? So fiscal policy basically gave a push to demand by increasing spending, maybe cash transfers, etc. But then because, monetary authority, the central bank has to actually, control inflation. What does the central bank have to do? What does monetary policy have to do? Has to actually unwind that demand push, by basically cutting down money supply. So what happens is when you have an economy with large supply side frictions, and you do a demand side push, then fiscal policy and monetary policy start working at cross purposes. Of course, not at the same point in time, but with a lag. Fiscal policy gives a demand side push, but monetary policy unwinds it. And so you get a short spurt of growth, but it's like steroidal, like you basically eat steroids, it goes away. But when you have supply side on the other hand, and through the demand side impact that it comes through the Say's law, construction sector activity as an example, you have demand that gets built up as well from the supply side. And then you basically get, you get monetary policy and fiscal policy working at, in tandem, not at cross purposes. Therefore, and the other thing, and this is, if you push both demand and supply, then you get prices the prices don't increase that much. Quantity increases much more, and that's why you get much more robust growth. It is not an ephemeral growth that you get. So I think both from fundamental economic principles and what I've observed with the, with crisis. Now let me contrast by what, exactly opposite that was done during the global financial crisis. What was done? No supply side reforms, no capex, and only demand side. And that demand side also, revenue expenditure were primarily focused on the richer folks. So, for instance, the farm loan waiver, 85,000 crores, which was basically, and I have a paper published in the Journal of Law and Economics where we've actually looked at. It was, 90% of it was cornered by rich farmers. Poor farmers didn't get it at all. Pay commission, again, actually more privileged people not. So as a result, what happened? You actually put money in the hands of people who basically buy more luxury items. So what happened? You had actually, and because domestic supply did not expand at all, imports grew significantly. Trade deficit widened a lot. Current account deficits, reached close to 6%, 5% plus, which is, unbearable. 2% is what is typically runaway inflation. Again, something that because you just gave a demand side push. Runaway 14%, 15% inflation, double-digit inflation for several months. Then what happened as a result? Severe monetary tightening. You had both, two governors, actually, Subbarao and Raghuram Rajan, basically, increasing rates a lot to bring inflation in control. And you had therefore, so whatever demand side push was given by the revenue spending, monetary policy unwound that. And as a result, what did we have? Fiscal deficit. Compare the numbers. India had a fiscal deficit almost 6% plus, when emerging economic peers had 2.5%. So we had almost 3 times as much fiscal deficit then. In contrast, now if you look at our fiscal deficit is 9.1%, the emerging economies is 10.5%. So we're about 85% of the fiscal deficit. So, because of just this demand side, no supply side reforms, etc., which is not what is basically right for India. You had runaway inflation, runaway current account deficit, and runaway fiscal deficit. And this triple whammy is what led to the, the taper tantrum. So, sum and substance of, I think I've given you a lot to mull over in terms of both the theory and the empirics. So for a country like India, I think just a simple or a simplistic Keynesian view, I think, is not quite right. In contrast, the Higgs multiplier, Samuelson, accelerator multiplier, which has capex as very important. That is what I think for a country like India with supply side frictions is a better way of actually thinking about the macroeconomy. So I think it's a combination of, my own thinking, contrasting India versus the US, but at the same time also looking at policy responses, across two crises, and this learning that I had by comparing India versus the US, which is why I think India is the only country that has done so much supply side measures. And mark my words, you'll start seeing demand going up as well. Q4, for instance, you had construction sector activity growing by 15%. And, at the same time, informal sector jobs being created as well. Demand, it comes with a lag. It doesn't happen immediately, the demand side, but it does indeed happen. And you'll get growth without actually, that much inflation. And last point, just as a fact I want to, mention, right, that in contrast to the runaway inflation that you had in the, global financial crisis, now, despite lockdowns, despite night curfews, when you have lockdowns and night curfews, the supply side gets impacted significantly because, foodstuffs cannot move in the night. They actually rot, right? They waste. And, so as a result, you have actually huge supply side shocks coming in from the, from these lockdowns and the night curfew. And yet, inflation has been 6.1% on average last year compared to the double-digit inflation, which again, illustrates the impact of supply side measures.
Yeah, that's great. In fact, just a couple of follow-ups on that. So on the other side, you've actually, even in your economic survey, you've talked about lower cost of capital as a very important part. And I guess a runaway fiscal would not help that at all, as you just mentioned. And correct. So, the fact that we are trying to get into the bond index and, and also, we expect. So would you say in your framework, a stable to a slightly even appreciating rupee and low interest rate is a far better scenario than, a push, as you said, demand push coming in? So is that like part of that whole jigsaw also, what we are trying to do on the cost of capital?
So, let me nuance it, right? I think that, if you, okay, let me take a step back. This chapter that we wrote in the economic survey this year, second chapter on debt sustainability, yes. I think that is very important. Oftentimes, we basically think about fiscal deficit as one number. What is important is, to distinguish between, is that fiscal deficit actually coming from capital expenditure, infrastructure spending from the government, or is it coming from revenue expenditure? I think that nuance is very important. I think just sort of a very broad brush, just saying fiscal deficit, that is not adequate. Why? Because of what I already said, but let me also add, fiscal multipliers, especially in a country like India, from capex, are much higher than that with revenue expenditure. So the bang for the buck that you get is much higher.
Right.
So, and what happens is that when the government borrows, let's say, an additional rupee to invest in capex, invest in let's say in infrastructure, two things happen. One, because of the multipliers, growth increases significantly.
Right.
And the other thing, and this is one of the a very important fallacy that remains, which I really want to debunk. A lot of commentators have this fallacy in their mind, which is the crowding out argument. In
Right.
fact, your question itself actually suggests to me that you had in your mind crowding out when asking that question.
So I was actually more talking about the revenue expenditure rather than capex. I was going to come to the capex expenditure. So I'm in same page as you are on this one.
No, but I think it is important to actually distinguish between crowding out, because when you mentioned about the cost of capital for private sector, if let's say the statement is being made that higher borrowing or higher fiscal deficit of the government actually may increase the cost of capital for the private sector, implicit in that is the crowding out argument. I think we have to recognize why, and let me sort of lay out the conceptual nuances very well. So suppose the pool of savings is fixed, it does not change, let's say, right? When the government takes out one additional rupee, there is one less rupee left for the private sector. Because there's less rupee left for the private sector, again, demand and supply of basically, of savings for the private sector is lower, interest rate goes up. This is your crowding out argument. Yeah. But, and we showed this in the economic survey this year, and that's where I want to come back to, if suppose that 1 rupee is taken for capex, you get growth. And very importantly, research over the last 10, 15 years has shown that savings is pro-cyclical to growth. That savings responds to growth, especially when you have a young demography. A lot of us have this idea in mind that actually, it's savings that leads to growth. It's investment that leads to growth, and savings then responds. So when you have basically government, taking an additional rupee for investing in capex that generates growth, increases savings. So your pool of savings now is larger. So, while this year government took out 1 more rupee, but next year the pool of savings is much greater. So you have crowding in rather than crowding out. And I think we've shown a lot of evidence. There is no evidence of crowding out in the Indian context. So I think this is very important to understand. Second point that is really critical is that debt sustainability is what we all have to worry about when we talk about fiscal deficit. And debt sustainability depends on the R minus G differential. You can think about it in nominal terms or in real terms. R is basically your cost of borrowing for the government, and G is the nominal, let's use it in nominal terms, the nominal rate of borrowing and the nominal rate of growth. Now, historically for India, this R minus G differential has been about minus 4.5%. In other words, growth has been higher than the nominal cost of capital by 4.5%. Going forward as well, this year, for instance, we are expecting double-digit growth in real terms. Take the deflator, nominal growth is likely to be 15-16%. Your R is 7%. So this year, about minus 8% is the R minus G differential. Going forward, FY23 and so on up for this decade, we are expecting 7% plus real growth for this decade. We've done the calculations. If you're interested, we can talk about it. But in the interest of time, let me not go into it. So 7% actually, if you take real terms, and 7% is the current cost of capital, but with the bond index inclusion, etc., on which measures are being taken, I expect that the cost of capital will be closer to 6%. So, a real growth rate of 7%, add about 4% deflator, 11.5% is your nominal growth, 6.5% is your cost of capital, 5% is your differential. That will basically bring down your debt. Debt will be sustainable. So these are the two things that is important. That is why the focus on capex driven growth, government push, focusing on capex is really critical.
Sure. Now I'll come to capex in a minute. Just where does rupee stand in? Is it a consequence what happens to rupee, or is there from this perspective, some, you think there is a range that one should follow, or how does that work?
See, this is of course the central bank's domain, and typically I don't comment on aspects that are in the central bank's domain. But there has been a sort of not an explicit one, but an implicit consensus that what we really target is a volatility in the rupee.
Right.
Not as much the level, because the level, there's of course the sides, the import side and the export side, and you have to sort of balance both of them.
Right.
But I don't, I there is no sort of level that is really targeted in
Right.
terms of the other point I would say, and I think oftentimes we focus far more on the currency for exports than on competitiveness. I'll give you the example, of India versus China. If you look at China in the 1970s versus, let's say, 2020, right? Or for, maybe till 2010, when there was a peg, they had pegged the currency. So the currency did not move much at all, right? India's currency in that period depreciated by huge, right? You basically has, and yet is it the case that our exports were actually much better than China? No. So I think we should not be overplaying the role of the currency in the in exports as well. Intrinsic competitiveness actually, I think, plays a very, very important role. So I think especially for exporters, they need to actually look at this simple piece of evidence to start telling themselves that it's all fine for all the time actually selling the government on the currency, but they need to work on their competitiveness as well.
Sure. Fair point. So coming to infrastructure, so there is this national monetization pipeline that has happened and looks pretty good. I've gone through both the documents and looks very doable. Also, there now the collection has been pretty decent over what we are seeing from tax collection buoyancy has been pretty good. Yet haven't seen much on the greenfield side from the government on this. That talks. What is the thought process here? Because clearly private sector is still kind of waiting, it looks like, and I guess capacity utilizations are still a bit low. So private sector is going to take its time. So government probably will have to play a bigger role here. And as you said, the multiplier can be pretty big. So what's the thought here?
See, the thought is exactly along the lines of what I've spoken. If you look at the budget commitment, the outlay that we've given, we've actually increased the outlay for capital expenditure by 35% this year, compared to last year. And in overall, India would be spending 2.5% of GDP, on capex this year, which is the highest ever. And as for, if you look at the data, and I've checked the data. The first quarter, despite the very, very intense second wave, as a result of which months of May and June were really impacted, you had a lot of state level restrictions, lockdowns, etc. Still, if you look at the run rate in terms of how much of capex, budgeted capex we've actually done 22.3% of the budgeted capex. That's typically the second half of the year is far, even in a normal year, the rate is basically high. It's like in a one-day game as well, the 40 to 50 overs actually run rates are typically higher than in the in some of the other overs. But I think so if you look at despite the second wave, we still basically did 22.3% of the budgeted capex. So we are absolutely on course to do the budgeted capital expenditure. As for the revenue expenditure, and this is something which is very important, there has, compared to last year, revenue expenditure fell by about 4.5%. One of the main reasons was because of the the GST transfer to states. So right. Which is a mechanical thing. In the month on 15th of July, there was a 75,000 crore transfer that was done. So I think, when we analyze things like this, we need to be taking into account the intertemporal differences. Sure. And I want to comment on this, that a lot of, analysis, I find oftentimes just, looking at one observation and trying to, infer a trend out of that. a trend requires at least 2 points, if not more, ideally many more.
Yeah.
So in general, I think we should be a little bit more careful in taking into account the intertemporal variation that happens. And so as for the capex, I'm absolutely confident that the budget capex will actually happen.
Right. And even the national monetization pipeline that is, that says that all the money that will come in probably will also go into greenfield investment. So is that the right assumption?
Yes, actually, in fact, the asset monetization, pipeline is to enable infrastructure. That is the most important. Do keep in mind that our budget, does not incorporate the proceeds from the asset monetization as revenues. Those are, basically, and that is one of the, I think the best parts of this budget, which was that we basically have underestimated revenues. Only what we are certain about, we actually have put it. So even our tax situation, revenue maybe will, by May will be greater than what we've projected. Asset monetization proceeds, we did not factor in, any proceeds from the privatization of the 2 public sector banks or the insurance company. Also, we haven't factored in. So if these come, those will all be cherry on the on the cake.
Sure. So you talked about privatization. One of the revenue items is privatization, and and you were actually in most of your economic survey, you actually talked a lot about that also. But somehow, at least the outside impression is much slower than what it should be. Like for example, BPCL, Concord should have been done by now. LIC probably we should have had a date given where the markets are. Is there, why this slightly slow? Is that like more procedural, or what's the take on that?
No, I think on this, the Honorable Finance Minister herself actually made provided a very clear answer that privatization actually requires a lot of not so glamorous work behind the scenes. There's a lot of dotting the I's, crossing the T's that has to happen behind the scenes, and that is the work is happening along on that. And in my discussions with the DIPAM secretary, actually, I come from, I come to the understanding that they should be meeting the targets that they've laid out. Do keep in mind that the LIC IPO actually will be a big contributor to that 1.75 trillion, rupees. So, but a broader point I want to make, which is that because, you focus this discussion on the structural matters, there is a very seminal change that has happened in India's economic thinking.
Right.
And that has to do with how we view the private sector. While, of course, pre-91, it was all public sector. But even the 30 years after liberalization, what reforms, whenever they've been done, they've been actually done by stealth. For instance, instead of using the word privatization, calling it disinvestment.
Correct.
That's sort of the euphemistic word, sort of which is really, walking through eggshells on things like these. In contrast, what you see now is the Honorable Prime Minister, going on the floor of Parliament and saying that private sector, it brings efficiencies and we must be respecting the private sector. Then he goes on to CII and says that, that earlier reforms were done by compulsion. Now reforms are being done by conviction. I think, this coming from the Honorable Prime Minister, I think is very, very important. I will mention that after the PM's speech on the floor of Parliament in the budget session, the next day, Hindu Business Line carried its lead editorial. It was called A Watershed Moment. That was the lead editorial. And they said that for the first time on the floor of Parliament, anybody in government has actually made this case. And the fact that it happens to be none other than the Prime Minister is very, very important. And then in the second paragraph, they mentioned that the intellectual background for this was provided by the Economic Survey. And I think that is what I want to talk about. Also, highlight that when you think about reforms, political economy is very important. It's not as if before now, people have not said oh, let the private sector, they bring more vibrancy, and that we need to do reforms, and enable the private sectors. It's not as if people before me have not said it. But people before me have always said it, saying by appealing to Adam Smith and his descendants. And
Yes.
the Indian citizen typically actually says, when you say Adam Smith and descendant, they worry about westernization of India's, India's overall fabric. And the polity reflects the preferences of the citizen. In any democracy, polity always reflects the preferences of the citizen, and that is something that we actually have to acknowledge. But when when it is said, and that is what we actually did in the economic survey, that look, wealth and wealth creation were part of our DNA. If you go and read Arthashastra, more than 2,500 years back, or down south, you go and read Tirukural, in my native, my mother native language, Tamil, you actually find Artha, and wealth and wealth creation being, being really extolled, right? Or, really being praised. And that is what is our DNA. And so when the common citizen says, oh, I didn't know that this was part of our DNA, that wealth creation has been part of our, that we actually write, Shubh Labh at home, and we don't write Shubh and Hani at home, or Ashubh and, Labh at home. We write Shubh Labh. So that is part of our DNA. I didn't know that. And I also didn't know that up until 1750, 80, this is not some Indian saying, Angus Madison in a book, published by Oxford University Press, saying that up until 1750, 80, India accounted for more than 33% of world's GDP because this was our DNA. Then the citizen says, yeah, okay, we basically must be thinking about returning back to our DNA, because that is what gave us so much of our prosperity. And I think that is actually very important, which is the reason I'm bringing this up, is to actually convey that the reforms, and this is reflected in the statement of the Honorable Prime Minister, saying that reforms are by conviction, is actually reflecting this aspect of what was our DNA. And I will end by saying that these ideas like communism and socialism were actually never part of India's. They were inherited from from Europe. So those are imports. They're actually not part of our DNA.
Right. In fact, I think the other thing is size. Size is good. Is the other part of this, right? Which is also, we are hearing more and more that
Absolutely.
Scale, which is a new thing again that we are hearing a lot.
Correct.
Right? So, yeah.
Correct. In fact, on that, I oftentimes mention, India scale. And when I used to, before my PhD, I used to work for this project lending institution, ICICI, and we used to have discussions about, people would talk about Singapore, and some of us would remark that the population of Singapore is basically the number of people who get into Churchgate Station between 5 o'clock and 6 o'clock. But it does actually therefore pose challenges. But I think now India is converting it into an opportunity.
Right. So coming to reforms again, and a lot of you've talked about. So is there a design to it? So I was actually even talking to Sanjeev Sanyal also, and he talked about framework reforms are like largely done, like GST, IBC, and so on. But one thing that I think is still kind of pending is this direct tax.
Yeah.
And we do hear a lot of even persecution, so to say, and a lot of Indian businessmen saying, so it's kind of everybody getting impacted rather than just the crony part that you talked about in your survey, right? What is the thought there? How do we change that?
See, I think there are some measures that have been taken. This, faceless assessment is a very important, aspect. So for instance, sometimes we hear some rumblings from those that are impacted by this. And I'm talking about it on the government side, those that have been impacted by the faceless assessment, which tells us that we are on the right track. Because if it is creating rumblings where it should, then it is basically saying that it is having its intended impact. So I think that's a very important step. But I do agree with you that the direct tax code actually needs to be given that indirect tax simplification has happened now. And while there are some parts, sort of aviation fuel, petrol, diesel are not part of GST, that part. But overall, I think a large part, the indirect tax, has been quite simplified. And now GST, seems to have stabilized as well. A similar process has to be done for direct taxes, I think, and that is something which there was a report that was submitted by the, by a group that was headed by Akhilesh Ranjan. I was part of that group for the last few months. I will say actually I did part. I was part of that group in the last 3 or 4 months. The group was working on it almost 2.5 years. Ideally, I would like more simplification. As an economist, I actually would prefer more simplification on, so a DTC that really is really simplified, is something, and I think that is what would be worth. So I think if a draft bill, tax bill that is ultra simplified is a lot more likely to sort of gain traction than what we have. It has made a lot of progress compared to the 1961 Income Tax Act, but I think the preference is for a very, very simplified tax regime, which just takes out all these, reduces all these exemptions, etc., keeps tax rate, a low tax rate, and thereby just makes it very easy, to sort of administer as well.
Right. And also I get a lot of retrospective issues, right? We just kind of came out with a retrospective, but even businessmen facing problems which is like 10-year-old and things opening up and stuff like that. I don't know whether that is being addressed in the direct tax.
The Vivad Se Vishwas scheme was precisely for that.
Yeah.
And not just that. And the retrospective tax.
So what I'm saying, anecdotally, that doesn't seem to be, yet gone down fully. I don't know. You keep hearing negative things, so maybe, that's getting solved, as you're saying.
See, let me make a broader point. When I used to teach, and I'm not taught for the last 2.5 years. I used to say this to my students, that the difference between good thinking and bad thinking is all an interplay between 3 A's. Good thinking is all about aggregates and averages. Bad thinking is about anecdotes. So and that's why I actually would be more careful.
Right.
I think on these issues, apart from the retrospective taxation, the law itself amendment, which I think is a very, very important step. Now I think Keynes and Vodafone, I think, should be basically finishing whatever overhang was left of the from the retrospective taxation. But at the same time, the Vivad Se Vishwas scheme was precisely an opportunity for the, and there have been a good amount that has come in. So I also will say, I think a broader aspect is that, see, private sector and government have to look to meet midway. I think, maybe because of the socialist era, there is also a tendency in the private sector to say, hum to wahi rahenge bhai, aap pura chal ke aao. That does not work. Right. When basically a Vivad Se Vishwas scheme has been launched and there's an opportunity, if you still want to go and fight it and you don't want to end it, and then I think then you sort of complain. I think, while I'm not denying at all that there is work to be done, but these things actually are very important steps that were taken as well. It's, I think, which must be. But bottom line, I will say that the direct tax, there is more work that is still required.
Sure. So in terms of now big reforms, so we've had labor reforms. Agri is still kind of done, but still a work in progress. GST is done. What are the big ones that are kind of left? IBCs, I guess, are another big one. But what are any other than direct tax that we talked about? Any other economic reforms still to be done?
I think the number one I would say is judicial reform.
Right.
I think that is really the big thing, because and we've written on that as well in the if you recall in the 2018-19 survey. Out of 192 countries in the World Bank's ease of doing business rankings, we rank in the 160s in the ease of enforcement of contracts. I think that is, for a country that is the fifth largest economy in the world, by any metric, I think that is something that is just not what portrays India in a good light. Here, I think the judiciary also needs to really recognize and get its act together. As Sri Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, focus on your Swadharma. Don't do parodharma, right? First their own dharma of basically, all the backlogs that are there, ensuring that the number of cases that are coming in a particular year, more than that is dealt with, so that there's actually backlog, not, instead of piling up, goes down. I think all these are very important. I think that is a big one that I would actually mention as really critical.
But there are a lot of vested interest in there, right? It'll take a long time to get this done.
Yeah, but I think if you see, is there a stronger, more emotional vested interest, in this country than farmers?
Right.
And yet this government has actually shown that the courage of conviction to actually do what is right. So at the same time, you've seen now the statements by both the Minister of Justice and the Chief Justice of India as well, that they do want to actually work on this. I think it will indeed require collaboration from both of them, both the government and the judiciary to really get this done. But I think that will be a very important step.
Right. So in terms of big ticket reforms, and these are the key ones that you think, so basically the direct tax and judiciary, you think are the key ones that are pending. Others are still, I guess, more like now tweaking them a bit is what, like a GST or a IBC and so on.
Yeah, because primarily what I would say is we need to take the number of measures that we've done to its logical conclusion. You did not mention actually among the key reforms, even more than the Farm Bill, and I think than labor reforms, is the enterprise policy focused on the private sector. The fact that the government basically has said that we will focus on doing what we are supposed to be doing, which is public goods, create public goods, and we will get away from things that actually private sector can do, which is running airlines or running hotels, etc., which the private sector can do. To me, that I think is a very, very important change in mindset. This goes back to some of the discussion that we had, about what the Honorable Prime Minister spoke about as well. So I think that when that policy will be taken to its logical conclusion, everything will except for a few strategic sectors, everything else will be the government will basically focus on only creating public goods and not on running businesses. I think that is a very important, very, very important reform. So I want to use that as an example to say that we've, in the last year and a half or so, and over a longer period as well, there's been a lot that has been done. I think taking these to the logical conclusion actually is quite important. For instance, IBC, there are still, it's a seminal piece of reform which basically I think really sort of has helped to put to rest this feudalistic mindset that used to prevail among the businesses, that they had the divine right to stay in control. I think that is now part of history, but there's work still to be done on IBC. So I think some of these, really making it optimal, bringing it to their full potential, I think is very important. I would say till that, I mean, the judicial reform, I think, and direct taxes actually can continue. These, implementation of these and taking them to the logical conclusion should be right now the priority.
Right. So in terms of financial system, I think when you first came in, the NBFC crisis had just kind of happened. I was talking to a CEO of one of the largest bank in India, and he's saying today the systemic risk is actually much lower than what it was despite COVID. It's
Correct.
much lower than. What's your view on this, and where do you think this whole thing stands?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned it because in these 2.5 years, as soon as I joined, the NBFC crisis happened, and then COVID crisis happened.
That's right.
So
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not complaining, but I'm saying I think in that sense, therefore, my learning has been just phenomenal because you learn. I think in a crisis, especially a once in a century crisis, you learn far more than I think in maybe 10-15 years of normal times.
Right.
So I think but that has been true, that actually I have sort of been in this office during a time where these two crises have been there. Overall, yes, I agree with you. In fact, I'll be honest, when we were entering COVID, I actually was genuinely worried about the financial sector, because we were actually, unlike other countries, we were entering the we were entering the crisis, in with a financial sector that was not that strong. While I actually was not, that worried about the real economy, I genuinely believe that there will be a V-shaped recovery. I think the resilience of the Indian economy has been shown through so many times. I was not worried about it, but the financial sector was something that I was genuinely worried about, at that time. I must say I'm actually pleasantly surprised by the financial sector. It's been a case of once bitten, twice shy,
Right.
because the financial sector entered, having just very, sort of these recent problems being a very fresh memory. They had not forgotten, I think, the many prudential lessons that actually were taught during this period, and they, I think, have implemented. So let me give you some of the data that I think suggests this. Right, one, for the first time in 5 years, all the public sector banks are profitable. Number one, they've recorded very good profits, not just last year, but even this quarter, Q1 as well. Second, if you look at the gross NPAs, have from about close to 5%, in March 2020. Now it is down to about 2.1%. So gross, net NPAs actually are down from about 5% to about 2%. This is about the existing assets and the existing profitability. But going forward, there will be NPAs in two areas: retail and SME. Those will be they will be there. Uh, there are guarantees that the government has given, so which is actually something that is that is good for the banking sector. But there will still be some hit for the for the banking sector. Here's where I think the rest of the features become very important. If you look at the provisioning that's been done, especially public sector banks, if you look at them, 88% is the level of provision coverage, the provision coverage ratio on average for the public sector banks. In other words, every rupee of expected loss that is going to come from the SME and the retail portfolios, which some of which will actually be taken care of by the credit guarantees by the government. What is left of that 88 paisa has already been taken care of. So in other words, firstly, the first loss will be taken care of by the credit guarantee. Whatever is left after that, of that 88% is already taken care of through the provision coverage. So the first line of defense is the credit guarantee of the government. Second line of defense is the provision coverage ratio. The third line of defense, which is for unexpected losses, which is your equity capital, even that has been beefed up now. The CRAR of 14.4%, for the banking sector as a whole, 14.4% for the public sector banks, is something that I'm just saying this from memory. Actually, you should check it. I think it may be for the banking sector as a whole, 14.4%, but public sector banks also are way above the regulatory norm, regulatory capital norm. So not only is the bad assets down, and banks have become profitable, the first, second, and third lines of defense for potential bad loans that will come, in SME and retail have already been built. So I think, that way the financial sector has come up. The only part that I actually still want to see in the financial sector is that there is still risk aversion among banks in lending to the large corporates. I think that is something that they have to, they have to overcome. They have to actually put in, I think, relevant analytical models to be able to infer, credit risk very well. So I think that's the one thing that's still, SME lending, I think is starting to pick up very well, even retail lending, but a large corporate lending is still something that I think has to go up. Though I think that one aspect is there, the large corporates and especially the, the listed firms, they've become not only very profitable, they also have deleveraged significantly.
That's right.
So, therefore they can, so there might be a demand issue as well. Maybe the large corporates do not need as much money, but there is some supply side aspect from the risk aversion, of the banks as well.
Sure. So I know we are running out of time. I just have two questions, two last questions. One is this: we keep hearing from corporates that we talk to about growth of organized over unorganized sector. That organized sector is becoming large, which probably should happen anyway, in a way. But what does it mean for jobs and for demand? Can we afford that as a country? What's your thought on that?
No, not only can we afford that, that is something that, we need. Because see, unlike in informal sector, formal sector jobs have two very important features. One, average earnings are higher in same job. You take basically informal sector versus formal sector, earnings are higher in the formal sector than the informal sector. But more importantly, not just the level, volatility in earnings is actually much lower in a formal sector job than in an informal sector job. And and I think as economists, we know very well that that consumption choices are driven not only by level of earnings but also the volatility of earnings. So in that sense, therefore, organized sector jobs are very important. I'll give you the example of countries that basically grew. Take the United States after the World Wars, the New Deal under President Roosevelt. That's when huge sections of population actually got lifted into the middle class. Cities like Michigan, for instance, right? In the and the entire Detroit in Michigan, grew because of this manufacturing sector activity, which created a lot of jobs in the organized sector, and that is what then put money in the hands of people. That actually enabled aggregate demand and thereby also then enabled investment. This is the virtuous cycle that we talked about in the in the 2018-19 survey. So in that, I think formalization and thereby creation of formal sector jobs is a critical element of this virtuous cycle. So what you're seeing is actually not accidental. It is part of the policy push in enabling more formalization.
Sure. Last question. Forex reserves, we are at now cross 600, all-time high. And is there any strategy on that in terms of what can be that used for? You keep hearing people's writing pieces that this should be used for this and that, but what are you guys thinking on this?
So see, this is something that requires very, very strong alignment in terms of what is the what is the optimal level of reserves, and alignment in terms of actual number between both the government and the central bank. Both of us will have to basically agree that any level beyond this threshold is excessive. I think that is the number one. You have a lot of people writing from the outside, but at the same time, it's also the case that that notion that this is more than adequate is certainly something that is not fully reflected yet among the among those that need to actually make these decisions talking on the regulatory side or regulator side. So that's the first aspect, right? I mean, my own view is that we have, if you use any metric, which is number of months of imports or proportion of short-term obligations, and both interest and principal repayments up until one year. Take any of those metrics. I think we have more than we need, and even for a 4-5 sigma event. So that's my view. But I think that, what is mandatory here is agreement on that. So because you can actually have, and two very intelligent people can have different views on this depending on their levels of risk aversion, right? So I think that's something that you have to recognize first. Only if that sort of synchronization happens in terms of what is maybe not a level but maybe a range at least, then you can start talking about how to employ, etc.
Right. Great. I think we can go on and on. I have too many questions, and maybe that will help. Maybe we'll do another chat, and that lots of things, interesting things that you've talked about, which I wanted to go deeper into. But I guess we'll leave it for some other day. And thank you, really, Dr. Subramanian, very much for this. I think that we learned a lot, and I'm sure we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.